In this video, we will look further into tax incidence. The tax incidence, again, tells us what side of the market, what party bears the burden of a tax, the economic burden of a tax. And in the last video, we have seen here that a payroll tax is partially passed on from the employers to the employees through lower net wages. And then the tax burden in this case is split more or less 50-50. So what we can see here, the incidence rule number one is that who bears the question, who bears the economic cost? Well, the answer is both. To what extent depends, as we will see, on the slope of the supply and demand curves, but both in principle bear the costs. And it does not matter who actually signs the check and transfers the funds to the exchequer. So that's incidence rule number two. Now let's look at number three, who wins and who loses. Okay? And so what we will look at here is how the incidence depends on the elasticity of supply and demand. Now that sounds very, very abstract, at least to some of you, and rightly so. So what do we mean by that? So let's start with labor supply. When is labor supply elastic? It's elastic when it's easy for workers to not supply labor or to supply more labor when there is a small change in prices. And so, for example, if you think about the labor supply to one firm, if that firm reduces its wages by even a small amount, if there is another firm next door that pays higher wages and is willing to hire those workers, the workers can easily switch. Whereas in other cases, there is no firm next door, and so it's for workers very hard to switch jobs. And so we would have in this market, I'm just going to draw two diagrams here next to one another. So you have an inelastic supply curve, which would look something like that. It's a very steep one. And you have an elastic supply curve that is a very flat one. Right? What's the rationale behind that? So remember, here on the vertical axis you have the wage, and here you have employment. So the best way to look at this is through wage changes. Right? So if labor supply is inelastic, and the most extreme case would be just a vertical line, then the employment, but the labor supplied to the market by workers would not change much if the wage changes. Okay, so if I change the wage from here to here, so let's say I start here, that's W1. And that is W2, and let's say we are in a situation where the wage is getting reduced. So then you can see here, if the labor supply is relatively inelastic, the amount supplied here would be L1, and then we would move down to L2. Okay, that's a fairly small change. Whereas if we go the same, and if we have the same wage change and the labor supply is very elastic, it would mean that in this graph that we move from a level L1 here down to pretty much zero. Okay, so it's a huge change for the same amount of decrease in wage. Okay? Or obviously the opposite would happen if we had an increase in wage. Okay, so why those reactions take place is either because workers can move to a different firm or can simply choose not to work at all, and so on. So there is a large literature in labor economics looking at the labor supply behavior of different groups in the population. and you have labor supply curves that are steep in the groups that where you think they should be. For example, prime-aged men, so men in their 30s and 40s, who have dependents, their labor supply behavior is typically quite inelastic. Right? Because especially in countries where you have a male breadwinner model, as much as this may be on the way out, but it's still a reality in many countries and in many families. And so then obviously the labor supply of the prime earner in the family is very inelastic, because that's the main earner. And that person cannot easily say, okay, I'm not going to work if the wage decreases, because they have to provide for their family. Right? Whereas then secondary earners tend to be those with a greater elasticity of labor supply. Or, for example, older workers tend to have a more elastic labor supply, because they may have accumulated wealth, they may have accumulated savings. So if then there is, for example, an economic crisis, wages go down, they may simply exit the labor market rather than work for a lower wage. These are just examples. There could also be, the workers can have the possibility to move more easily or less easily to a different firm, or they may move, geographically relocate to a different labor market, whereas others pretty much have to stay put. And then those who have to stay put, their labor supply is more inelastic than of those who have the opportunity to move elsewhere. Okay, and so you can think about the same goes then for demand. If you have a very steep demand curve, that means demand is very inelastic. So no matter what the wage is, that company will always demand the same amount of labor. If the labor demand curve is very elastic, it's very flat, it means that a small change in wages will change the labor demand massively. Yeah? And so depending on the elasticity of the demand and supply curve, the elasticity of the demand and supply curve determine which side of the market actually pays the greater economic cost for a tax. And that's incidence rule number 3. So let's look at this in this graph here. Right? So I've chosen here 2 extremes. So the one extreme on the left is inelastic demand and elastic supply. So here it's very easy for workers to move away from firms or to just exit the labor force. So a small change in wages leads to a huge change in labor supply. Whereas for firms will always demand this roughly the same amount of labor. So what's going to happen is the payroll tax gets levied on the firms. And now, because it's so easy for the workers to move away, firms can only pass on a small fraction of the payroll tax onto the workers. And you can see this here. So the net wage for workers, as you can see here, doesn't decrease an awful lot. And it's actually the firms that bear most of the economic cost of the tax, whereas the cost for the workers, the economic cost, is very, very small. And they also bear a much smaller portion of the deadweight loss compared to what the employers pay. Now, in the picture on the right, we have a different scenario. Now we are in a world where we have elastic demand and inelastic supply. So here again, you can think about this very simply, that here it's very hard for workers to move away or do anything if wages change. So no matter what the wage is, there will always be a lot of workers who are willing to work. So in that case, the firms will have it very easy to pass on that tax burden to pass on the tax to the workers through lower wages, because workers have to swallow it because they have not many other options. And so in that case, as you can see here, the economic cost for employers is very small, but it's very high for the employees because they have very inelastic supply, and they bear most of the tax burden, and they also bear most of the deadweight loss. So it very much, the economic incidence of a tax very much depends on what side of the market has more elastic supply and or demand. So again, to summarize, we learned the three rules of tax incidence, namely, the economic cost is generally split, maybe not 50-50, but it's split between both sides of the market. And it does not matter who writes the check. So the economic and the statutory incidence are very, very different things. And it would be very naive to say whoever writes the check also bears the economic cost. It's absolutely not the case. That depends very much on how much the market side on whom that tax is imposed is able to pass on that tax through prices or wages to the other side of the market. And we've seen that if the other side of the market has a very elastic either supply or demand curve, it's difficult to pass on a tax to that side of the market, whereas if their supply or demand is very inelastic, it's very easy, and so that side of the market will then bear a greater chunk of the incidence.